Out on the edge of nowhere, where the earth lay cracked like old leather beneath an unrelenting sun, Elias March worked his fields in solitude. Known to the few who passed through as the lone farmer, he coaxed life from parched soil that others had abandoned. Tall and lean, with shoulders sculpted by years of hauling water and lifting sacks of feed, he spoke little beyond what the land required. One pale morning, as the sun's first rays gilded the horizon, Elias walked out to inspect a broken fence post at the western edge of his property. He hummed an old lullaby under his breath, the same soft tune his father had sung to him on cool summer nights. When he reached the spot, he froze. Huddled against the weathered wood was a boy no older than 10, clad in ragged shirts and trousers, his small frame trembling beneath the heat. The child's dark eyes met Elias's with equal measures of fear and hope. Elias knelt and offered his hand. The boy hesitated only a moment before placing his dusty fingers into Elias's rough palm. Without a word, Elias lifted him and carried him back toward the cabin that stood squat against the open plain. Inside the humble clapboard house, Elias seated the boy on the wooden rocking chair by the window and brought him water in a chipped tin bowl. When Elias handed over a piece of stale bread, the boy stared as if afraid it might vanish before he could taste it. Yet hunger won out. He pressed the bread to his lips, and relief swept across his face as he drank deeply. Elias fetched a clean shirt and trousers from an old trunk, and the boy changed in silence. Elias braided the child's dusty hair with gentle fingers, smoothing away what remained of the boy's terror. Then Elias asked, "What's your name?" The boy looked away, silent. Elias did not press further. Names could wait. Shelter and food could not. As evening painted the sky in soft mauve and gold, Elias ladled hearty bean stew into bowls and set one before the boy. He watched the firelight dance in the child's eyes, but the boy would not eat. Instead, he fingered a small wooden carving tucked into his shirt, a crude figure of a child hugging a bear. Elias noticed the keepsake and bowed his head, respecting whatever story lay behind it. When night fell, Elias spread a spare blanket on the cot and sat on its edge. The boy crawled under the blanket without a word, except in the shelter, as though it were a new world. Elias watched him settle, then turned away, pulling his hat low to hide the softness in his eyes. In the hush of that first night, two lives touched, a silent farmer and a voiceless orphan, each seeking something they had lost. And in that shared stillness, something fragile and precious took root, the promise of belonging, of a new beginning. When dawn broke, Elias rose quietly and padded to the cot. The boy lay curled beneath the blanket, eyelashes resting like fragile wings against pale cheeks. Elias tilted back the blanket and offered his hand. The boy took it, rising unsteadily, and together they stepped onto the porch as the first light painted the fields gold. Elias led him out among the rows of stunted cornstalks. "Pull the weeds," he said, pointing at the dry earth where thirsty shoots struggled. The boy crouched and grasped a handful of gray-green leaves, dragging them free. Elias moved beside him, guiding his small hands to the roots. Sweat beaded on both their brows, and without words they shared the rhythm of work. Bend, tug, discard. After an hour, Elias reached into his pocket and withdrew a rough scrap of paper and a stub of pencil. He knelt and drew two simple columns. On the left, pictures of weeds. On the right, shapes of newly planted corn kernels. He drew the boy's fingers next to the weeds, then next to the kernels. The boy nodded, understanding at last. Elias counted out kernels and pressed them one by one into furrows, showing the boy how life sprang from a careful hands. By midday, they paused beneath the lone mesquite at the field's edge. Elias broke the bread he'd baked yesterday. The boy ate ravenously now, crumbs clinging to his chin, and for the first time, a soft sound escaped his throat. An attempt at thanks that vanished with a swallow. Elias smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Good," he said. "Brave." The boy's lips curled into the smallest of grins. As the sun climbed, a distant thunder of hooves echoed across the plains. The boy froze. Elias stood shading his eyes. On the horizon rode three figures, wide-brimmed hats low, backs rigid in the saddles. Elias's jaw tightened. Whoever they were, they rode with purpose. He stepped in front of the boy, blocking sight of the cabin at the field's edge. "Stay here," he whispered. The boy watched, heart pounding, as Elias lifted his hat and strode toward the riders. Each step carried the weight of this new life they'd begun together. Elias' march would protect this child. No matter what came galloping across the dusty horizon, Elias squared his shoulders and rode out to meet the riders, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. As he drew closer, he saw the glint of badges pinned to their chests. Men of law, faces weathered by decades of sun and wind. The lead marshal tipped his hat and pulled his horse to a halt. "Elias, march," he called, voice firm. "I am," Elias replied. His grip tightened on the reins, but his tone stayed calm. "What brings lawmen to my fields?" The marshal's gaze flicked past Elias toward the cabin. "We're looking for a boy," he said. "An orphan named Tom went missing from Silver Creek Orphanage 2 weeks past. Folks say he vanished without a trace." Elias felt his breath catch. Tom. That must be the boy's name. He glanced back at the cabin's edge where the child stood, clutching the carving of the bear. The boy's wide eyes met Elias's. He swallowed hard, bracing himself for what might come next. "Boy, safe here," Elias said. "He's under my roof and won't be leaving." The marshal frowned. "Elias, we're not here to cause trouble, but if the boy is wanted, he's been wanted for nothing," Elias cut in. His voice, low and steady, carried a weight that stilled the other men. "He's a child who needs care, not a jail cell." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. The law was clear. Missing children were to be returned to the orphanage, even if the orphanage itself was a harsh place. But something in the boy's posture, fragile, trusting, made Elias's stance feel right. The marshal studied Elias's face for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll consider this handled," he said, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "But if word comes down from the judge, we'll cross that when we come to it," Elias replied, lifting his hat in farewell. As the three riders turned their horses and disappeared into the heat haze, the boy ran to Elias's side, relief flooding his features. Elias knelt and wrapped him in a one-armed embrace, careful not to crush the small body against his chest. "You're safe," he whispered. The boy's head found Elias's shoulder, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. They rode back to the cabin together, the afternoon sun glaring overhead, and Elias lifted the boy into the safety of his arms once more. Inside the quiet room, the boy pressed the wooden bear to his heart, eyes shining with unshed tears. Elias set a fresh loaf of bread before him and watched as he ate, slower now, savoring each bite. That night, Elias sat by the window, carving a new toy from a scrap of wood, a horse for the boy to ride in dreams. The boy watched, rapt, then reached out to tentatively touch Elias's work. In the flickering lantern light, Elias saw a spark of hope ignite in the boy's eyes. When the carving was done, Elias handed it over. The boy turned it in his hands, tracing the grain of the wood, before looking up and placing the horse in Elias's palm. Without a word, the boy pressed his forehead against Elias's arm in a gesture older than any language. In the silence that followed, Elias understood that the bond between them was sealed, not by words but by deeds. No longer mere guardian in charge, they were family. And as the wind whispered against the cabin walls, both found comfort in the promise of tomorrow's dawn. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a rare gift in the relentless summer heat. Elias led the boy, Tom, he'd finally decided to call him, beyond the fence line and into the open prairie. In Tom's small satchel lay the wooden horse and a single loaf of bread. In Elias's saddlebags, a change of clothes for Tom and a flask of water for both. They followed a faint trail toward Silver Creek, a dusty settlement 10 miles east, where Elias intended to purchase supplies for the farm's lean months ahead. As they rode, Tom's laughter rippled through the air when a meadowlark darted across their path, its song trilling like a promise. Elias allowed himself a rare smile. By midday, low clouds gathered on the horizon. Dark shapes of thunderheads loomed, promising a storm. Elias pulled Tom close and guided him beneath a lone cottonwood, its wide branches offering scant shelter. Rain began in fat, heavy drops, rattling leaves and sending rivulets down their hats. Elias unstrapped an oilcloth from his saddle and draped it over Tom's shoulders. "Stay close," he said, voice firm over the thunder's growl. Tom nodded, clutching the cloth around his chin. Elias scanned the plains, knowing how quickly a summer storm could swell the creek into a churning torrent. They set off again, spurred by necessity in the mounting roar of water. They reached the ford just as the rain turned to a deluge. The creek's waters, once a shallow ribbon, now surged between banks muddied by rain. Elias dismounted and led their horses across, steadying each animal against the current. Tom watched, heart pounding, until Elias reappeared with both horses safely on the far bank. Elias wiped rain from his brow and offered Tom his hand. Tom wrapped his fingers around Elias's calloused palm, and together they climbed back into the saddles. As they neared Silver Creek, the storm broke in full fury, waves of rain sweeping the plains. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the silhouette of a crooked sheriff's office in the middle of town. Elias urged his horse forward, determined to reach shelter before the storm drove them back onto the open prairie. Tom leaned forward, trusting Elias entirely. The wind roared in their ears, but within the bond they shared, a fierce warmth burned, a certainty that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Silver Creek's dusty main street lay slick beneath the lingering rain. The wooden sidewalks warped and swollen, where puddles pulled in low spots. Elias guided Tom to a narrow doorway beneath a faded green awning. Mrs. Callahan's general store. Inside, lantern light flickered against shelves laden with tins of beans, cloth bolts, and hickory farm tools. A stout woman in a faded calico dress peered over her spectacles. "Shelter from the storm, I reckon," she said, voice warm but guarded. Tom nodded, water dripping from his hair onto the plank floor. Elias tipped his hat. "Just looking to restock flour, coffee, maybe a bolt of canvas." He swept a hand toward Tom. "And this one's new to town." Mrs. Callahan studied Tom's wide eyes, lingering on the wooden horse carving tucked in his satchel. "Well, you're welcome here, but mark my words, stranger. Word travels fast in Silver Creek. Folks will want to know who you're traveling with." She reached under the counter and produced a small loaf of brown bread. On the house, she added, pressing it into Tom's trembling hands. You look like you could use it. Elias exchanged a grateful glance, then filled his basket. Coffee beans wrapped in oilcloth, a sack of flour, extra canvas to patch torn clothing, and a small lantern to replace the one whose glass had cracked. When he set the items on the counter, Mrs. Callahan rang them up quietly, her eyes flicking to a row of wanted posters tacked above the fireplace. One showed a boy's face, Tom's face alongside the words "missing from Silver Creek Orphanage." Tom stiffened. Elias placed a steady hand on his shoulder. He's with me, Elias said low enough that only Mrs. Callahan could hear. He's safe. The woman sighed. I'll hold off the marshal if they come looking today. But you best be careful. The orphanage matrons got powerful friends. She nodded toward the posters, then brushed flour from her hands. That's all for today. Stepping back into the street, Elias hoisted the canvas-wrapped bundle onto his saddle and took Tom's hand. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The clouds broke enough to reveal a sliver of sun sinking low in the west. As they passed the sheriff's office, Tom glanced at the barred windows and the badge pinned above the door. Elias caught his eye and gave a reassuring squeeze. Let's ride, Elias said. We've got miles to cover before the creek floods again. Tom climbed into the saddle with practiced ease, clutching the little loaf Mrs. Callahan had given him. Elias swung up beside him, took the reins and nudged his horse forward. Behind them, Silver Creek's warm lamplight faded into the gathering dusk, and beyond it, the open prairie beckoned, wide, untamed, and full of promise. As they set out across the wet ground, Tom whispered into Elias's ear, "Thank you, Papa." Elias felt a swell of something he hadn't known since his youth, pride, hope, and a fierce protectiveness. Together they rode into the twilight, bound by their journey and by the promise of a tomorrow they would forge together. Night settled around Elias and Tom like a soft cloak. Above them, the prairie's vast ceiling of stars shimmered with ancient light. Elias guided their horses toward a shallow wash lined with sagebrush and mesquite, a hidden spot where he often camped when rain made the fields impassable. He dismounted first and led the animals to a knotted mesquite trunk, looping their rhizs around a low branch. Tom watched carefully as though each new task were a lesson. Elias showed him how to peel back the canvas bundle and spread it flat as a ground cloth, then staked its corners with 3 carved wooden pegs and a sturdy iron hook. When the little shelter was secure, Elias stacked small stones to form a fire ring and gathered dry wood beneath the overhang of a rocky ledge. Tom crouched beside him, arms wrapped around his knees. "Papa," he said quietly, "will they follow us here?" His voice was small but steady, a boy finding his strength. "They might," Elias admitted, arranging kindling at the fire center. "But I've memorized these trails. We'll stay hidden until first light, then move west toward the mountains. Once we reach the ridge, no one will track us in the canyons." Tom picked up a smooth stone and studied the constellations above until he found Orion's belt. 3 bright stars aligned like arrowheads. "Papa," he whispered, "my used to tell me those stars guide lost children home." Elias laid a hand on Tom's shoulder. "Home is wherever we build it," he said. Then he struck a flint and tender spark, coaxing the fire to life. The flames flickered gold, illuminating Tom's hopeful face. They shared the rest of the brown loaf, tearing pieces and letting the warm fire chase away the evening chill. Tom pressed the little wooden horse into Elias's palm. For the journey, he said, his dark eyes shining. Elias nodded and hooked the carving onto his belt. We'll make it, he promised, together. As the fire crackled, Elias pulled from his saddle a tattered journal, his father's filled with weathered maps and notes about hidden springs and game trails. He opened to a blank page and drew a rough sketch of their route. Across the prairie, over the swollen creek, into the foothills where shelter awaited. Tom leaned close, tracing the lines with his fingertip. When the flames burned low, Elias blew them out and helped Tom slip beneath the canvas. He tucked the boy's worn blanket around him, then climbed into his own makeshift bedroll. Under that endless sky, with coyotes howling in the distance, neither spoke again. In the hush that followed, father and son drifted into dreams of rain-washed fields and sunlit peaks. Dreams of tomorrow's journey under the same stars that once guided a lost boy home. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the canvas, painting pale stripes across Tom's sleeping face. Elias stirred, stretched, and whispered for Tom to rise. They packed slowly, horses fed, canvas rolled, and the fire ring stowed away so no telltale signs lingered. With the journal map tucked inside Elias's breast pocket and the wooden horse riding secure on Tom's belt, they followed the faint game trail that wound uphill. The foothills rose in soft slopes at first, dotted with thorny scrub and sun-bleached rocks. Tom stumbled once, catching himself against Elias's broad leg, and Elias steadied him without a word. The boy's legs burned from the climb, but he pressed on, determined not to slow their journey. Above them, buzzards wheeled in the sky, as indifferent to their passage as the wind that sculpted the hills. By midday, they reached a narrow ravine where the trail dipped sharply. The earth here was loose. Elias dismounted and led the horses down one at a time, Tom walking beside him with careful footsteps. A sudden rustle in the underbrush froze them both. Then a bobcat slipped across the shale, vanishing among boulders. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and Elias smiled, nodding toward the wild creature. The land belongs to them as much as it does to us, he said. Tom swallowed and tightened his grip on the reins. At a natural spring in the ravine floor, Elias knelt and coaxed water from a cool pool. He filled their flasks, then dipped his hands into the water and offered the bowl to Tom, who drank eagerly. Elias watched him drink, remembering how many days had passed before anyone had offered him a single drop. When Tom finished, he pulled from his pocket the wooden bear carving, worn now at the edges, and laid it beside the spring. He dipped it in and watched droplets bead on the smooth wood before lifting it back, refreshed. They pressed on, the trail climbing again toward a ridge of jagged peaks. The air grew thinner and cooler. Tom shivered despite his jacket. Elias draped his own coat around the boy's shoulders. Almost there, he promised. Once we crest the ridge, we'll find a safe place to rest. An old miner's cabin my father marked here years ago. Together they climbed the final stretch, each step echoing with hope and the wild promise of the western sky. When they reached the top, they paused, horses heaving, hearts full, and gazed out across the endless horizon. Below them lay a landscape of hidden valleys and shadowed canyons, unclaimed and free. Tom squeezed Elias's hand, and Elias knew that at last they were truly on their own path. From the ridge's crest, Elias led Tom down a narrow ridge trail, winding along the cliff's edge until they stumbled upon it. A squat miner's cabin half buried in a crescent of boulders and pines. Weathered logs chinked with moss, held firm against time, and a crooked chimney promised dry warmth. Elias grinned, dismounting to pat one of the horses. "Home for tonight," he said softly. Inside the cabin smelled of centuries-old wood and sputtering smoke from long-cooled embers. A heavy plank door groaned as Elias pushed it open. He knelt to clear away debris, revealing a stone hearth and a sturdy iron kettle. Tom followed, flashlight beam dancing over a rough table, a pair of creaking stools, and a single cot in the corner. The place was Spartan but safe. Elias swept aside pine needles and set to work. He built a small fire in the hearth, lifted the kettle to warm water, then unpacked their supplies: flour, coffee, and the last of the salted pork from Silver Creek. As the kettle sang, Elias mixed dough for a simple flatbread, pressing it thin against iron skillet. Tom watched, eyes bright with anticipation. When the bread was golden and steaming, Elias slid it onto the table and ladled steaming coffee into tin cups. Tom's hands trembled as he lifted his cup. He blew on the surface before sipping, warmth blooming in his chest. "It's good," he said, tasting the bread and pork together. Elias nodded, proud. Night crept across the windows as they filled their bellies. Outside, a distant wolf's howl echoed through the pines. Tom flinched. Elias set his cup down and placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "They're just voices in the dark," he said. "We're safe here." Tom nodded, but when their meal was done, he gathered the blankets from the cot and laid them near the fire. Elias unhooked the wooden horse from his belt and handed it to Tom. "For Dream," he said. Tom pressed it to his heart, a quiet promise of home. Before sleep claimed them, Elias fetched the tattered journal and opened to the map of hidden springs. By the hearth glow, he traced the route they take at dawn deeper into the mountains, where the orphanage's reach could not follow. Tom leaned against Elias, trusting without question. Under the cabin's low roof, father and son drifted toward a peaceful slumber, the world outside forgotten for the night. In that warm glow, they found the true comfort of home, together safe and bound by a promise that nothing would tear them apart. As the first blush of dawn lit the cabin's window, Elias and Tom stepped outside into a world washed clean by last night's rain. The valley lay before them, emerald ferns nodding in the gentle breeze, the creek's silver ribbon glinting through sun-dappled pines. Elias inhaled the crisp mountain air and felt for the first time since he'd been alone that he truly belonged. Tom stood beside him, holding the wooden horse and bear close against his chest. He lifted his chin, eyes bright, and spoke the first words that mattered most. "Papa, I'm not afraid anymore." Elias smiled, a warmth blooming behind his weathered eyes. "Nor am I, son." Together they rode out into the valley, their horses' hooves silent on the soft earth. Over the days that followed, they tended a small garden by the creek's bank, coaxed sprouts of wild onions from the rich soil, and patched the cabin's roof with fresh canvas. Neighbors, trappers, and homesteaders who rarely ventured this deep came and went, but none questioned the quiet family that lived among the whispering pines. In the evenings, Elias sat on the porch's rough, hewn bench, while Tom played by the hearth, the wooden toys clacking against the floorboards. Sometimes Tom would tell stories of the orphanage he'd left behind, and Elias would listen, nodding, until the boy's eyes grew heavy, and he slid into sleep with his head in Elias's lap. Seasons turned. Corn sprouted in neat rows by the cabin, and the flatbread they baked in the iron skillet grew richer as the garden flourished. Tom's voice, once stifled by fear, filled the cabin with laughter and song. On long summer nights, They lay side by side under the stars, and Tom would trace Orion's belt with his finger, whispering, "These guided me here." Elias pressed the boy's hand to his heart. "And I will guide you always," he promised. Years later, when townsfolk whispered of the lone farmer's miracle son, they spoke not of lawmen and orphanages, but of love's stubborn bloom on barren land. In that hidden valley, far from the orphanage's reach and the judge's decree, Elias March and his son Tom built a home where the wind carried their laughter, the creek sang lullabies, and two souls once lost found each other at last.